In a forgotten corner of the city, where streetlights flicker and alleyways are lined with stories untold, a man pedals slowly on a rusted bicycle. His hands are rough, his shirt faded, and his eyes, tired yet unwavering, carry a quiet strength. To the world, he is invisible, just another street vendor, another face in the crowd, but to one little girl he is everything. Every morning, before the sun rises, he slips out with a stack of lottery tickets and a dream tucked in his pocket. Not a dream for himself, but for her. She wears a school uniform stitched together more times than she can count, rides a bike missing one pedal, and smiles like her world is perfect. Because to her, it is. Behind every notebook in her backpack, every slice of bread on her plate, lies a sacrifice. A choice. A father who gave up comfort, pride, and even his name, just to see her smile. This is not a story of fame or riches. It's a story of silent endurance, of a man who dared to fall so his child could rise, and today, for the first time, his story will be heard. Every day at exactly 6:45 am, a man appeared at the same street corner near Lincoln Elementary. Rain or shine, he stood there quietly, a small wooden tray hanging from his neck, filled with lottery tickets. Most people passed him without a glance. A few regulars nodded politely. None ever asked his name. But there was something peculiar about him. Unlike other sellers, he never pushed anyone to buy. He simply waited, eyes scanning the school gates across the street, always watching, never speaking. To the children he was the silent man. To the staff, a background figure. Yet one teacher, Miss Clara, began to wonder. Why did he only show up during school hours? And why, every time a small girl in a patched-up uniform ran by, his lips curved into the faintest smile, like his whole world lit up? There was a quiet sorrow in his posture, a weight that clung to him like mist. He wasn't just selling tickets. He was waiting. For something. Or someone. And Miss Clara couldn't shake the feeling that his story ran deeper than any of them had imagined. She arrived every morning with a boundless smile and a book bag almost as big as her. Her school uniform, faded and threadbare, had patches sewn with mismatched thread. Carefully, lovingly. Her shoes, scuffed and nearly falling apart, squeaked with each step, but she never seemed to notice. Her name was Leela. 8 years old, always early, always polite. She greeted the janitor, waved to the lunch lady, and bowed to her teachers. Her cheerfulness masked the quiet truth her classmates didn't see. She came to school hungry more often than not, and her homework was written in pencil stubs on scraps of recycled paper. Yet, she never asked for help, never complained. Miss Clara, watching from her classroom window, began to piece things together. Leela always ran from the same alley, and every time she crossed the street, the silent lottery man turned his gaze toward her with a mixture of pride and pain. It was subtle, but unmistakable. One day, Leela dropped her notebook, and Miss Clara saw a name scribbled inside. Property of Leela Tran. The surname sent a jolt down her spine. She turned slowly to look out the window at the man on the street. Tran. At the edge of the city, where the pavement gave way to gravel and forgotten lots, stood a shack made of plywood, tarps, and rusted sheet metal. It leaned slightly to one side, as if wary from holding itself together. A single dim bulb hung by a frayed wire, flickering against the creeping dusk. Inside, the space was barely big enough for two. A foam mattress lay on crates, covered with a thin blanket. A small pot steamed on a makeshift stove. Leela sat cross-legged, humming softly as she did her homework under the dim light. Across from her, the lottery man, Mr. Tran, sorted through his unsold tickets, each one a silent prayer for tomorrow. His hands, once steady and skilled, now trembled slightly as he counted coins. Barely enough for rice and oil. On the wall, taped with care, was a drawing, Leela holding a diploma, her father smiling behind her. The drawing was old, crinkled at the edges, but to them, it was more real than anything outside those tin walls. They had little. But every stitch, every meal, every word shared beneath that fragile roof carried a wealth the world had long forgotten: love without condition. Each morning before sunrise, Mr. Tran rose silently. He brewed a small pot of tea, left half for Leela, and packed the other half in a dented thermos. Then he wheeled out his bicycle, a rusty, groaning thing with one pedal missing, and a squeaky chain that refused to stay oiled. He tied his lottery tray to the handlebars with a shoelace, secured with hope and habit. The road from their shack to the school was over 5 miles, winding through alleys and busy intersections. He pedaled slowly, the uneven bike wobbling under him. But he never stopped. His eyes always watched the sidewalk, scanning for potholes, stray dogs, or anything that could endanger the worn wheels beneath him. By the time Leela stepped out, sleepy-eyed with braids still loose, the bicycle was ready, cleaned with a rag and waiting like a loyal steed. She climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. They said nothing during the ride. Words weren't needed. The rhythm of the squeaking wheels, and the wind through their silence said everything. This was their ritual. Their bond. And no matter how broken the bike, it carried two souls moving toward a future they refused to give up on. Lincoln Elementary was always filled with the usual hum of children. Laughing, shouting, bickering over lunch trades. But around Leela, there was a different kind of silence. A quiet respect, perhaps, or something closer to distance. She was kind, bright, and always the first to raise her hand. Yet, no one truly knew her. She never joined recess games, never invited anyone over, never talked about her weekends. When the class discussed vacations or birthday parties, Leela simply smiled and looked out the window. Miss Clara began noticing how quickly Leela disappeared after the bell rang. No after-school clubs, no hanging around, just a quick goodbye and a sprint toward the gate, where the lottery man always waited, never stepping onto school grounds. Once, during parent-teacher conferences, Miss Clara scanned the list. Leela's row was blank, no contact number, no emergency guardian, just a note in pencil. Will come if needed. Tran. That silence around her wasn't accidental, it was chosen, or worse, forced. Miss Clara couldn't ignore it anymore. She had seen these signs before. Not neglect, not abuse, but something deeper. Something like sacrifice disguised as absence. And she intended to find out why. In the crowded maze of alleyways behind the train yard, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Everyone in the slum had heard of Mr. Tran. The man who rarely spoke, always paid rent on time, and kept to himself. He lived in the last shack at the far end, where no streetlights reached. The neighbors called him the ghost tenant. He never asked for help, never attended community meetings, and never complained when rainwater flooded his floor. Some said he was a refugee. Others believed he was hiding from the law. A few claimed he had once been rich but lost everything in a single night. The children feared him at first. His limp, his silence, the long scar running down his right forearm. But then they saw Leela. Sweet, soft-spoken, always clutching his hand. That changed the narrative. Might be strange, one old woman muttered. But he loves that childlike life itself. Still, no one knew his story. Not even the landlord who had taken his rent in wrinkled bills for over 5 years. Mr. Tran gave nothing away. Except, perhaps, to that little girl. And behind every whisper, there was one common thread. Whatever he was running from, he was running for her. The next day, Miss Clara couldn't shake the image from her mind. She searched online, digging through old university directories, professional forums, and archived news clippings. Hours passed until finally, she found it. Tran Menthau graduated top of his class from Caltech in mechanical engineering. Later, he earned a second degree in biomedical engineering, and had been recruited by a prestigious hospital to work on prosthetics for children. Brilliant. Respected. A rising star. Further down the page, she found a conference video. There he was. Clean-cut, confident. Presenting a breakthrough in affordable limb design for underprivileged youth. He spoke with passion, not pride. His eyes lit up when he mentioned accessibility for children like my future daughter. And just like that, it clicked. He had once had everything: a career, a purpose, a family. What had shattered that life? What storm had come strong enough to strip a man like that of everything? Except his daughter. Miss Clara printed the page, folded it neatly, and placed it in a folder labeled simply, "Why?" She wasn't searching out of curiosity anymore. She was searching for justice. For a man who had clearly given up his world to preserve someone else's. Mr. Tran, then still Juter Tran, was driving home after a 36-hour shift. His wife, Mai, had just given birth to their daughter, and he was rushing to be by their side. The city was soaked, headlights blurry, horns echoing through the storm. On the final stretch, a delivery truck ran a red light. The crash was brutal. The driver walked away with minor injuries. But Mai, seated in the passenger seat, died instantly. Tran survived, with 2 broken legs, a fractured spine, and the devastating knowledge that the love of his life was gone. He was unconscious for weeks. When he woke, doctors told him he might never walk properly again. But worse than the physical pain was the silence in the room when he asked about Mai. The hospital, fearing liability, distanced itself from the case. The media called it an unfortunate accident, and the truck company settled quietly out of court. But for Tran, there was no closure, only ashes. In a matter of hours, he had lost his wife, his health, and his place in the world. All that remained was a newborn girl, and a vow he whispered through clenched teeth. "You'll never know suffering, my daughter. I will carry it all for you." The funeral was quiet. No headlines. No hospital representatives. Just a few colleagues who came out of guilt rather than love, and an infant wrapped in a thin blanket, cradled in a wheelchair-bound father's arms. Mr. Tran didn't cry. He couldn't. Something inside him had gone numb. After months in rehab, the hospital offered him a desk job, a demotion cloaked in sympathy, but Tran refused. Every hallway reminded him of May. Every face, every file, every sterile white wall screamed of her absence. He resigned quietly, with no extended family in the States, and no insurance payout large enough to sustain their life. He moved out of their apartment. Bills piled up, medical expenses bled his savings dry, childcare became impossible. Jobs were scarce for a man who couldn't stand for long and refused to leave his infant daughter in a stranger's care. So he sold the car. Then the furniture. Then the wedding rings. By the time Leela was walking, they were living in the shack. But he never let her see him break. Every night, he kissed her forehead and said, "Daddy's strong, little one. You just dream." Only the moonlight ever saw the truth. Him weeping silently into his pillow, clutching her baby sock like a lifeline. Before the accident, Tran was invited to speak at global conferences. He dined with doctors, engineers, and executives. His name appeared in journals. He wore pressed suits, held patents, mentored interns. Now, he patched his shirt with fishing line and bought expired bread at closing time. He applied for jobs. Hundreds of them. But no one wanted a limping man with a child in tow and a 6-year resume gap. Some laughed politely. Others ghosted him entirely. A few offered janitorial positions. Positions he accepted with gratitude. But those jobs never lasted long. If Leela had a fever, he had to leave. If her school called, he'd run, not walk, not ask. Over time, overqualified, turned to unreliable. Desperation forced him to sell handmade trinkets, then lottery tickets, anything to bring in coins without leaving Leela alone. He learned to survive invisibly. Slipping through alleys before dawn, eating less so she could eat more, ignoring stares from those who once called him doctor. And through it all, he never once told Leela who he used to be. Not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want her to dream of the past. He wanted her to dream forward. On cold mornings, Mr. Tran walked with a slight sway, dragging his right foot just a little behind. Most thought it was age or exhaustion. Only a few noticed the way he winced every time he stepped on uneven pavement. The accident had shattered both femurs, torn through muscle, and compressed nerves in his lower spine. Surgeons saved his ability to walk. But just barely. With physical therapy, braces, and painkillers, they said he could function. But he chose Leela over rehab. Every hour in therapy was an hour away from her. So he learned to live with the limp, the cane, the spasms that visited him in the dead of night. He fashioned custom padding for his shoes from cardboard and foam. He memorized sidewalks to avoid sudden drops. And when the pain became too much, he gripped his tray of lottery tickets tighter, using it like armor. Once, a young boy on the street asked him why he limped. He smiled and replied, "Because I used to fly." The boy laughed. Tran did too. But only he knew the truth. Those broken legs were a reminder. Not of weakness, but of the path he had chosen. To carry a future, no matter the cost. The first time Mr. Tran walked Leela to school, he wore his best shirt. A white button-up. Yellowed at the collar, but carefully pressed. He stood outside the gates until the bell rang, then limped away slowly, making sure she didn't look back. Behind the nearest tree, he waited. Each day, he returned to that spot. Watching. Guarding. Praying no one would laugh at her worn shoes, or question the holes in her backpack. He knew children could be cruel without meaning to. And he couldn't afford her heart to break like his had. Once. Leela came home. Excited her class was going on a field trip. The fee. The 10 that night, he skipped dinner. 2 days later he sold his watch, May's final gift, to cover the cost. He made sure Leela never saw the receipt or the empty space on his wrist. Another day she needed colored pencils. He told her he'd find them. That week. He worked into the night. Selling tickets by streetlight, coughing from the cold. When she got the pencils, she hugged him tight and said, "You always make it work, Daddy." He smiled. Then turned away and cried, because he didn't know if he could keep making it work tomorrow. Dinner at the Tran household was simple, always. A small tin bowl of rice, sometimes fluffy, sometimes hardened from leftovers. And beside it, a dish of coarse salt, pepper, and, on rare occasions, a slice of pickled vegetable. "Eat slowly," Mr. Tran would say. "It tastes better that way." Leela obeyed, never questioning. To her, this was normal. She even created games. Pretending each grain of rice was a star, and she was saving the galaxy by eating them one by one. Tran watched her with aching pride. There were nights when he pretended to eat. He'd shift the food around in his bowl while telling her stories. Fairy tales. Fables. Sometimes he'd say he already ate. The vendor's stall. Or, "A friend gave me soup." Lies told with love. One evening, Leela offered him her last spoonful. "You didn't eat much, Daddy." He smiled, gently pushing it back. "I'm full just seeing you happy." After she fell asleep, he finished the cold rice she left behind. In the dark, he licked the salt from the edge of the bowl and whispered into the night. Just one more day. Just one more miracle. He didn't pray for wealth, he prayed for enough. One chilly Thursday morning, as Mr. Tran returned from his street corner, he noticed a small paper bag hanging from the doorknob of their shack. It was plain, crinkled, and tied with a single red ribbon. He looked around. No footsteps, no voices. Just the rustle of leaves and a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Inside the bag, a loaf of fresh bread, still warm, a box of crayons, and a small envelope with 20, folded carefully, no note. No sender. That night, he hesitated before showing Leela. But the way her eyes lit up at the crayons, the way she gasped like she'd found treasure, made him forget his doubts, if only for a moment. Still, a question gnawed at him. Who knew? Who had been watching? The next day, another bag appeared. Then the next week, again, sometimes food, sometimes supplies, always quiet. He asked the neighbors. No one knew. Some said it was charity. Others muttered about ghosts. Tran said nothing. But in his heart, gratitude warred with shame. Because while the world often ignored him, someone, somewhere, had seen through the silence. And that terrified him more than hunger ever had. Hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, shoved to the back corner of their shack, was a weathered metal box. Dented, rusted at the corners, and sealed with a single piece of fraying twine. Mr. Tran hadn't opened it in years. It had once sat proudly on a bookshelf in his old apartment, alongside medical textbooks and framed photos. Now, it gathered dust next to broken tools and torn shoes. But after the mysterious gifts began appearing, he couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, after Leela fell asleep, he lit a candle and untied the twine. Inside were fragments of a life long buried, his medical degree, still rolled in its cracked leather case, May's wedding ring, a newspaper clipping. Dietar. Tran develops low-cost pediatric limb prototype. And a sealed envelope, addressed simply, "For Leela, when she's ready." He stared at that envelope for hours. It wasn't time. Not yet. She was too young to carry his past. But something inside him shifted. The box wasn't just a vault of memories. It was a reminder that before the hunger and the silence, he had been more. And maybe, just maybe, he still was. Miss Clara had taught for over 20 years. She'd seen children come and go, some with lunchboxes full of snacks, others with bruises they wouldn't explain. But Leela Tran stood out in a different way. She was never absent, never late. Her handwriting was neat. Her essays were vivid, almost too mature. And yet her eyes, they carried a quiet weight. Then came the day Leela fainted during gym class. Just a dizzy spell, the nurse said. But when Miss Clara offered her a granola bar, Leela hesitated. Then devoured it like she hadn't eaten all day. That was when the puzzle pieces came together, the patched-up uniform, the shy withdrawal, the mystery man outside the school gate, the envelope marked, T. Tran. Miss Clara opened the student file again. No records of past schools, no listed guardian other than father, no health insurance information. Nothing and everything. She didn't want to intrude, but something told her this wasn't neglect. It was sacrifice. And it wasn't fair. So that evening, for the first time, she stepped outside the gates and approached the man who always disappeared before anyone could ask. Mr. Tran, she said softly, and the man who had spent years hiding turned and looked up. The multipurpose room buzzed with chatter. Folding chairs lined up in rows. Bulletin boards filled with student art. Plates of cookies and juice boxes sat on the table. It was parent-teacher night at Lincoln Elementary. One by one, parents arrived, smiling, proud, asking questions, taking notes. Children beamed as their mothers and fathers pointed to drawings and test scores on the wall. But Leela sat alone. Miss Clara watched her from across the room, heart tightening. The girl tried to smile, fiddling with the frayed edge of her sleeve. She had set up her desk with 2 chairs, just in case, but only one was occupied. No footsteps came. Outside, in the shadows near the bike racks, Mr. Tran stood silently, watching from afar, just as he always did. He didn't enter. He couldn't. His clothes were stained, his shoes cracked. The room was warm and filled with polished people. He didn't belong in there, he thought. He might embarrass her. Miss Clara finally stepped away from the parents and approached Leela. Would you like me to sit with you? Leela's eyes widened. Grateful, but hesitant. And in that moment, Miss Clara silently vowed no child should ever feel invisible. Especially not one loved this much. The next morning, Miss Clara arrived at school early. Not to grade papers, but to investigate. She contacted the district office, asking discreetly about Leela Tran's records. What she received stunned her: enrollment papers with barely any supporting documentation. No previous school transcripts. No vaccination record. Just a handwritten form, signed, Tran, and a local P.O. box as the mailing address. That same day, she visited the address on file. It wasn't a home, it was a storage facility. Worried but cautious, Clara visited the slums near the train yard, asking around. At first, people were suspicious. But when she mentioned the little girl with the big eyes and the quiet man with the limp, they softened. Is a good father. One woman said. Doesn't ask for anything. Just lives for that child. Later, Clara spotted the shack. Its walls patched with old campaign signs and tarp. She stood in silence, heart aching. She didn't knock. Not yet. Instead, she returned to school and began writing a letter. Not to report them, but to protect them. Because she now understood this wasn't a case of neglect. It was a story of love hidden behind pride. And she would not let it be ignored. Miss Clara didn't type it. She wrote it by hand. Carefully, deliberately, with the same patience she used when grading Leela's essays. The letter wasn't long. Just 1 page. But every word was heavy with purpose. She addressed it to the school board. But it was meant for anyone with power. And a conscience. To whom it may concern. There is a child in our care who arrives early, learns eagerly, and never complains. Her name is Leela Tran. Her father sells lottery tickets on the street. He walks with a limp, wears shoes that no longer fit, and never steps inside the school. But I have never met a man who fights harder for his child's future. He does not ask for help. So I will, not for pity, not for charity, but for recognition. This is not a case of negligence. It is a case of heroism hidden in plain sight. She submitted it anonymously, unsure what would come next. She didn't expect a reply. But the next week, the letter was quietly forwarded to the district superintendent. By the end of the month, A copy had reached a local journalist, and within days, the world that had once ignored Mr. Tran began to listen. When the knock came at his door, Mr. Tran hesitated. It wasn't rent day. It wasn't the police. It was a young woman in a neat blazer holding a clipboard. Mr. Tran. My name is Evelyn. I'm from the Education Outreach Committee. May I come in? He didn't want her to see the cracked floor or the exposed wiring. But something in her eyes, respect, not pity, made him nod. As they spoke, Leela sat quietly nearby, coloring with the crayons from the mysterious bag weeks ago. Evelyn gently asked, "Do you still have any of your credentials?" Tran stood silently, then reached under the mattress. From a hidden pocket in the foam, he pulled out a red leather folder. Worn, edges peeling. Inside was his medical degree, signed, sealed, real. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she read the embossed letters, Doctor of Biomedical Engineering, California Institute of Technology. She looked up. "Mr. Tran, why didn't you ever come forward?" He answered simply, "Because my title never fed my daughter. But selling tickets did." She said nothing. But in that moment, she understood this man had given up recognition for survival. And that was the truest kind of nobility. A week after the article was published, Mr. Tran received a letter. It came in a sleek envelope, embossed with a familiar logo, Haventech Biomedical Solutions. His former employer. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Dear Dr. Tran, we recently became aware of your story. On behalf of the company, we offer our sincerest apologies for the way your departure was handled. It is clear that your situation was met with silence, when what you needed was support. You were one of our brightest minds. Your early prototypes continue to shape affordable prosthetic innovation across Southeast Asia. We were wrong to let you go. We hope it's not too late to make amends." Enclosed was a second letter, this one personal from the CO who once mentored him. Along with it an open invitation to return, in any capacity, with full medical support and flexible accommodations. Mr. Tran sat for a long time, staring at the letter. Leela peeked over his shoulder. "Is that from someone important?" she asked. He smiled gently, folding the letter. "No, sweetheart. It's from someone who finally remembered." He didn't know if he'd accept. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't in years seen. It started with a headline in the local paper. "The silent genius selling tickets, a father's fall, a daughter's future." Then came the photo. Mr. Tran, weathered and stoic, standing beneath a streetlight, Leela's hand wrapped in his. The article, written with care and compassion, told everything: the accident, the loss, the daily sacrifices, the brilliant mind behind a street vendor's eyes. Within hours, the story went viral. Comments poured in. Donations followed, offers of help, scholarships, legal aid. A woman from Oregon even offered them a place to stay rent-free for a year. But most powerful of all were the letters. Handwritten, typed, emailed, people sharing their own stories of loss, of struggle, of redemption. They called Mr. Tran a hero, an inspiration, a symbol of quiet strength in a noisy world. Miss Clara watched it unfold from her desk, heart full. At school, students who once ignored Leela now sat beside her. Teachers spoke to her with gentle reverence. One janitor even fixed her desk, tightened the screws, added padding to the legs. Mr. Tran never asked for any of it. But for once, the world wasn't offering pity, it was offering thanks. Within 72 hours of the article's release, hashtags began trending. Fast stand with Matren, Fife silent father hero, wife daughter deserves more. Reddit threads exploded with theories, support, and offers to crowdfund. TikTok creators made tearful videos recounting the story. Influencers, usually silent on such matters, shared the article, urging followers to donate or write letters to the school board, the city council, even the governor. A YouTuber known for philanthropy created a video titled, "I met the smartest man living in a shack." It hit 4 million views in 2 days. In just 1 week, over 110,000 was raised through GoFundMe. But what touched Mr. Tran most wasn't the money. It was a simple comment beneath a repost of the article. "I grew up like Leela. I know what it's like to have a parent sacrifice everything. Please tell Mr. Tran he's not alone anymore." That night, for the first time in years, Mr. Tran sat beside Leela and read the comments aloud. translating the kind words, the offers, the prayers. Leela looked up and whispered, "Here we famous." He chuckled. "No, sweetie, we're seen." And for a man who spent years in the shadows, that was worth more than gold. A week after the fundraiser exploded, a representative arrived at Mr. Tran's door with a check. 110 Zalozen raised in your name, she said, smiling. "It's yours, Mr. Tran. You can move, fix your leg, start over." He looked at the paper. More money than he had seen in a lifetime. Then, slowly, he pushed it back across the table. "I didn't ask for this," he said gently. "Please, return it." The woman blinked. "Sir, it's a gift. I appreciate it. I truly do. But we don't need charity, we need dignity." She hesitated. "What if we used it for Leela's education fund? Something just for her." He paused, then nodded. "If it's for her future, and her future only, then yes, but none for me. I didn't raise her to wait for help, I raised her to rise." The representative left in awe. News spread quickly. Father returns six-figure donation, asks only for daughter's education. And just like that, admiration turned to reverence. He had proven once more what he lacked in wealth. He made up for an unshakable honor. At the height of the media buzz, when interviews and letters came in waves, someone finally asked Mr. Tran directly, "If you could wish for anything right now, just one thing, what would it be?" He paused, smiled shyly, and looked down at his hands. "I'd like to buy my daughter a new pair of shoes. Ones that don't squeak, ones that fit." The reporter blinked, expecting a bigger answer, a job, a house, a future. But Mr. Tran continued. "She's worn the same shoes for 2 years. The soles are paper thin, she never complains, but I see her wincing when she walks home. I tell her we're saving up, but..." He looked away, voice trailing off. The next morning, dozens of shoeboxes arrived at the school. Different sizes, colors, brands. Some from strangers, others from children writing messages inside. "For Lila, the strongest girl, I don't even know." When Leela tried on her favorite pair, red canvas with stars, she turned to her father and said, "Do I look fast now?" He laughed through a lump in his throat. "You always were, little one. Now the world can see it too." The auditorium buzzed with excitement, banners fluttered, cameras flashed. Proud families filled the rows, holding flowers and balloons. On stage, Leela stood in her cap and gown. Taller now, eyes bright with dreams. Her name was called. Applause erupted. But the man who clapped the hardest wasn't seated in the crowd. He stood behind the velvet curtain stage left, peeking through the gap, heart pounding. Mr. Tran didn't want to sit among the audience. He didn't need the spotlight. This was her moment. As Leela received her diploma, she scanned the crowd, then looked to the side curtain and smiled. She knew. After the ceremony, cameras searched for Mr. Tran. Journalists, school officials, even former classmates approached. But he was already gone, walking slowly back to the edge of the parking lot, bouquet in hand, a pair of polished shoes in his bag, just in case hers wore out again. Miss Clara caught him just before he disappeared. "She did it, Mr. Tran." He nodded, voice thick. "No, we did. I just walked behind her, every step of the way." She smiled, fighting tears. And for the first time, the world clapped for the man who never stepped on stage. Because he was too busy holding it up. Weeks after the graduation, on a quiet evening filled with summer breeze and golden light, Leela found a small envelope on her desk. It was old. Edges curled, the ink slightly faded. It simply read, "To Leela, when you're ready." Inside was a handwritten letter. "My dearest little star. If you're reading this, you've made it farther than I ever dreamed, and I'm proud. Not because you graduated, but because you did it with kindness, strength, and grace. You've always asked me what I used to be. I never told you, because I didn't want you to feel small in the shadow of who I was. But now I realize. You were never in my shadow. I've always been walking in yours. Yes, I was a doctor, an engineer, a speaker, but the most important thing I ever became was your father. If life gives you a stage, take it. If it hands you silence, sing louder, and if ever you fall, know I'll be there, even if only in memory, lifting you from behind the curtain. Go live boldly, go love fully, and never forget, I gave you everything I had, and I'd do it all again. Always, Dad. Some heroes wear capes. Others wear lab coats. But the truest kind, they walk with a limp, sell lottery tickets in the rain, and stitch hope into every meal they skip. Mr. Tran never wanted the spotlight. He never demanded justice, fame, or sympathy. All he wanted was to shield his daughter from the world's harshness, even if it meant absorbing every blow himself. He could have reclaimed his career, he could have accepted fame, but he chose something nobler: dignity, humility, and an unbreakable love that asked for nothing in return. Leela's story will be told in degrees, awards, and headlines. But his story lives in quiet moments: the patched shoes, the missed meals, the silent sacrifices no one ever saw. Until now, in a world obsessed with success, Mr. Tran reminds us that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes, it whispers in alleyways and rides broken bicycles at dawn. And maybe, just maybe, the strongest kind of love is the one that stands behind you, quietly, so you can walk without ever looking back.